So some things about me. I was born in Australia, into an Adventist family that was a loving Adventist family. I grew up on a farm growing pineapples in Queensland in the northeastern state. Was homeschooled, which was my way of getting, my mother's way of giving us an Adventist education, I think. And then eventually, well, I should mention that round about, I was 13. I was 13 and 6 foot, and seemingly mature, but only seemingly. And the question came: should I go to junior camp, which was supposedly up to age 15, or to youth camp, which started at 15? And my parents talked to the conference youth leader about that, and it was decided I would go to both of them. And it turned out I was much more mature than those who came to the junior camp. And then the juniors left, let us say, on a Monday, and the youth were arriving on a Tuesday. And in between, I thought I was the only person in the boys' dorm, but lo and behold, a counsellor from the junior camp came down, and who I knew from a previous church that we'd attended, and he said, let's choose adjoining beds so that we can talk to each other. And during that night, I had my first sexual experience, thanks to him. And so that's a sort of an interesting beginning. And then I went back home, and I sort of suddenly knew the word homosexual and knew a little bit about it, that homosexuals existed and what they could do. And it wasn't until I went to university that I started to realize that the world didn't really like this, and neither did the church. And I then spent the next 15, 16 years struggling not to be gay. Meanwhile, I'm in university, I do honours in history, I do a PhD in sociology and history. I get a Fulbright to a postdoc at Columbia University, and I arrive in New York. And I'm still struggling not to be gay. And it's been a very painful and time-consuming journey for me. And I must say that story is very typical of the Adventists who grew up to find themselves gay, in that generation at least. And so I arrived in New York. I didn't know a soul, and I really said, well, how do I get to know people and not feel so lonely? Well, the obvious answer was to go to church. I'd missed the first Sabbath. The second Sabbath, I went to church and found out where one was and went there. And two important things happened that day at church. First of all, my Sabbath school teacher was a British guy by the name of Colin Cook. And I should tell you a little bit about him and his background. He was British. In his writings, he tells that his father was a deep-sea fisherman and therefore away from home much of the time. Colin tended to blame that for his sexuality. And then he grew up in a church which was rapidly becoming black. And he went to Newbold, studied theology, but didn't get a job in Britain because they were looking for black pastors. And so he came to New York, and there he was, living at the Evangelistic Center in downtown Manhattan, midtown Manhattan, and preaching two lunch hours a week in the Battery Park at the bottom end of Manhattan, where he had quite a large audience 2 days a week. And I found in that Sabbath school class that I was at that he really had quite a drawing personality, and he surprised me because I came from Australia and I'd had a lot of interaction with Desmond Ford, and I knew what Desmond Ford called the gospel. And I didn't think Americans had the gospel very much. But there was Colin teaching the gospel in a Sabbath school class. So it was a good Sabbath school class. My first impression of Colin was very positive. And over the potluck, the pastor of the church talked to me, discovered I was at Columbia University, and said, "Are you aware that there's a group of graduate students meeting every week in the chapel at Columbia?" And I said, "Wow, no, tell me about it." And he gave me a number to call. And the next week I went to what turned out to be the Adventist Forum, meeting in this magnificent building with a 5-manual organ, and I'm an organist. That became my church for the rest of my 45 years in New York City. So that's my background. Now, between my arrival in New York and the next vignette I'm going to tell you, I had to say to God, "Why are you taking so long to answer my prayers? Why is this taking so long? Why am I still the same, even though I've been praying to be changed?" And he didn't answer me the way God doesn't answer. You know how it is. And so I said, "Well, what's going on here, God? Is it that you can't change me, or that you're choosing not to change me?" And I didn't want to believe he couldn't do it. So I believed in my heart that he chose not to, because he was happy with me the way he had made me. And so that was how I came at age 34 to accept my sexuality. And when I had to preach a sermon at the forum 2 or 3 months later, I chose to talk about that subject and to come out to the congregation the same way as the German guy decided to come out at the beginning of January this year. And I came out, and it caused some ruffles, but the group elected me their president about 3 or 4 months later than that. So I was the leader of the forum in New York for 40 years after that. Now, that leads me to the second vignette with Colin Cook. I got a phone call from a pastor in the Greater New York Conference saying, "I have a baby and I would like her to be dedicated in a beautiful place. Is it possible for you to include a baby dedication in your service next Sabbath?" And I agreed, yes, that was possible. And he came with his wife and child and another pastor, the other pastor to do the dedicating. And that other pastor was Colin Cook. So we had our service, and our habit in those days was to have the service first and then to go downstairs to a rather different space, which was used for all sorts of things, for our Sabbath school class. And we would go through, I think we were going through Abraham Joshua Heschel's book on Isaiah at the time as our Sabbath school class. And we went through that, and the 2 pastors were there too. But Colin was steaming, apparently, during the class, because he could see on the wall at the back of the door, there was a poster which was advertising a gay dance which was going to take place the next Friday night in that very space. And at the end of the Sabbath school class, he went over and he ripped the poster off the wall. And I said to myself, wow, this guy's got a problem with being gay. And whereas I hadn't come out yet when I first met him. I had come out, but I hadn't I wasn't about to tell Colin Cook I was gay, but we all went to the other pastor's house for lunch, and the two pastors and the pastor's family and me. And on the way, we drove out to Long Island. Colin and I had this sort of academic type conversation about whether he should have pulled the thing off the wall or not. So that was sort of my second contact with Colin. It was only some months later that Colin was caught in his room at the New York Evangelistic Center, having a tryst with somebody who he'd met somewhere, and brought back to his room. And he was fired, and that was a just devastating blow to Colin. And he did everything he could immediately to try to turn that around. He went to the Adventist Psychiatric Hospital in Massachusetts and asked them to change him. He went to all sorts of other places and asked them to change him. He looked for a girlfriend for the first time that I'm aware of. And it was towards the end of the 70s that he wrote a series of 3 articles in Insight magazine on how to change from being gay. And those magazine articles, I'm told by the people who ran the magazine at the time, there were more than 100 responses from people wanting to know how they could change, how could they get involved in a program. And that gave Colin the idea that he could start a program, and he did that in Reading, Pennsylvania, and he called that the Quest Learning Center. And all that was in preparation in the beginning of 1980. Now let's go back a little bit in my history and to form what happened then. I had come out as being gay when I was 34, but I didn't know how to meet gay people. And in my mind, what I wanted was a Christian gay relationship. And I didn't know how to find people. I went to a couple of gay bars. I was totally uncomfortable there, and wasn't what I'd been brought up for. And so I went. I eventually put an ad in the national gay newspaper, The Advocate, and it basically said, "Gay Adventists write to me." And I got between 40 and 50 replies. Now, this was before internet, of course, and when long-distance phone calls were expensive, and they were all a long way away. They were all sort of mostly over the Rockies and a couple between the Rockies and Chicago, and nobody anywhere near New York. But those people, it was odd because that same year, that was, I think, 1976, a couple of other gay guys, Adventists, put similar ads in The Advocate without us knowing each other. And from those names that were collected, this became important in the founding of Kinship. And Kinship was founded, especially because so many of them were in California, was founded in Southern California in about, I think, 1977. And it was just a Southern California organization for a couple of years. But in the end of 1979, they decided that they were going to have a national camp meeting, and that was going to be in Arizona. And one of the members drove drive-away cars around America, following up rumors of gay Adventists. That's how I was met, and I came to become closer to the people in Southern California. And at the end of 1979, when they were planning the camp meeting, they invited me to come and be part of the planning. And I was on my way to Australia, so I stopped off in Los Angeles, and I was there for 2 or 3 days and got to know them. And one of the things that struck me strongly was that we all had the same question. The question was, does God accept us? We were not sure. And that was a really big hole in our hearts. We did not know whether God accepted us or not. And I said, this is our question. We're all asking the same one. We need to have the best scholars we can find to answer those questions at our first camp meeting. And of course, since I made this suggestion, they said, well, would you please find some speakers? So I didn't really know anybody very much, and I had to ask around. And I eventually ended up with 3 seminarians. They all turned out to be from the Adventist seminary, and 2 pastors, a man and a woman. Those were the 5 speakers. But when the 3 from Andrews realized there were 3 from Andrews, their original idea was to sort of try to slip away and without asking permission. But when there were 3 of them, they felt they couldn't do that. And so they felt they had to ask permission. So Jim Cox, the head of the New Testament department at Andrews, wrote a letter to Neil Wilson. And the result of this was a meeting at LaGuardia Airport between Neil Wilson's representative, Duncan Eva, who was the special assistant to the president at that time, and Jim Cox and me. And Duncan brought messages from Neil Wilson. They were willing to support us. They wanted us to have the camp meeting. They were willing to even pay the way of the 5 clergy to come, both their board and their transportation. But there were 2 things that they asked. One, we couldn't say that they'd accepted homosexuality. They were just trying to help us have a camp meeting. And secondly, we had to have a 6th speaker, and that 6th speaker was Colin Cook. Now, we'd all read the articles in Insight, and so the prospect of having somebody come to say the only way God accepts you is to change was something that we'd all been dealing with all our lives. And we certainly didn't want to hear that. Again, we wanted to know whether God accepted us as we were. And but we had no alternative. If we wanted to have the other speakers, we had to have Colin Cook. Neil Wilson insisted on that. And so we had Colin Cook too. It was his meeting was, well, there was arguments, of course, but it was unremarkable. And the real focus was on the other 5 for the camp meeting. It was a remarkable camp meeting. And they all said, God accepts you as you are. You were called to keep the same sort of behavioral rules as straight people. You were called to have loving Christian relationship and be faithful to your partner. That was basically what they told us. And so that was how we came to have our first campaign and to have one every year after that. The trouble was that once Colin Cook started, he got publicity in Ministry magazine. And the publicity was in an issue that went not just to Adventist ministers, but every second issue went to all sorts of ministers around America. So suddenly the evangelical ministers who were against homosexuality, but didn't have an answer if someone came to them saying, I've got a homosexual problem, what should I do? they had an answer. And they said to their members who with these questions, go to Quest Learning Centre and Colin Cook will show you how to become straight. So it wasn't just Adventists there, and there were plenty of Adventists there, but there were people from other denominations too, evangelical denominations, Baptists, Pentecostals, etc. Ministry Magazine gave a great deal of publicity to the program. Now, meanwhile, it hadn't started quite yet. I'm a little bit, let me come back. In 1982, Colin Cook gave a weekend seminar at the Church of the Advent Hope in New York. And I went there. It was Friday night, Sabbath morning during Sabbath school time, and Sabbath afternoon. So there were 3 meetings. And I was really very uncomfortable during those meetings because what he was saying made absolutely no sense in terms of my years of struggle. He was basically saying to do the same thing. I knew it didn't work, but he was saying it worked. The next year, our camp meeting was in Pennsylvania. And I realized only a few days before we started that it was very close to Reading. And by this time, the program was going in Reading. And I said to Bob Bouchard, who was the president of Kinship, I think we need to take the opportunity to find out about Quest. And so on the Sunday afternoon, the very beginning of camp meeting, we went and spent the afternoon at Quest. And Colin had choreographed 4 testimonies that we heard. And again, there was this sort of sense among all of us of disbelief. What we heard just did not line up with our experiences at all. The most impressive testimony was the first guy, who was a Canadian guy. And at the end, he came to me and he said, you know, I can't work here because I'm Canadian. I've got no money, but I'd really like to come to camp meeting. And so I talked to Bob and we said, sure, you can come. So he came to the camp meeting, and during that week, he had a camp romance. And that absolutely shocked me, and it even made me guilty that it was happening, in terms of it was so out of step with what he'd said in his testimony. So towards the end of the week, I pulled him aside and I asked him about his camp romance and how that fitted in to the testimony he'd given the previous Sunday. And he said to me that the testimonies that we gave were based on faith, not on the results that we'd had. That was true for all the testimonies. Testimonies based on faith, not upon their experience. And then he added that the night before that, Saturday night, I went to a gay bar in Philadelphia and I met somebody and I went home with him. And yet the very next day, he was giving this testimony about victory over homosexuality. Now, what that did to me was to say, I was planning my study on global Adventism by this point, that I had to include a study of Colin Cook and his program in my study. Colin also started an organization called Homosexuals Anonymous, which was a 12-step program, except his steps were 14. And he had branches of Homosexuals Anonymous around the country and in other countries. And he became the leading intellectual in the ex-gay movement. And he was the major speaker for 2 or 3 years at the annual conferences of Exodus International. You've probably heard of it at Exodus International. It was the big name for a long time in ex-gay ministries. They eventually closed down because they realized that they were selling something that didn't work, and they apologized for what they'd done. The next thing, meanwhile, I've started my studies. I'm traveling around the world doing interviews with Adventists. I come back from a series of interviews for 8 months in time for the camp meeting, which was at Toronto in 1986. And a few days into the camp meeting, a guy who I'd never met before said, "Can I talk to you?" I said, "Sure." He said, "I've been part of the Quest Learning Centre. I want to tell you what happened to me there, what I've been going through." And he told me this whole story about very intimate relationship with the counseling relationship, which turned sexual many times. And he said this was true for everybody. I was absolutely amazed. And we eventually talked about it in the whole camp meeting. And I agreed that we had to find out about what was going on and from other people. And I said, okay, I will move up my study of Quest, and I will do it this fall. So I did the study in the fall of 1986. And I asked Colin to give me a random sample of his of the people who had been through the program. He refused. So Craig, the guy who I'd met at the camp meeting, became very important because he knew the people there. And I said to Craig, I have to interview some people who are considered successes there. And he found 5 people who were thought of in the program as being successful in their change of orientation. And I interviewed a total of 14. They included one who was a kid of 16. And they included one older man. Most of them were in their 19 to 27, 28 age bracket. But one man was in his 50s. And it turned out, first of all, that Colin had sexual stuff happen between him and all but the old man. His interest was apparently in young guys. And so he had sexual stuff happen in his counseling sessions with the young guys. But the old man felt abused too, because he was there being counseled, and Colin had asked him for a loan of a substantial amount of money as a personal loan. And he felt that he couldn't say no because of the counseling relationship. And yet he also knew that counselors were not supposed to do things like that, that was considered unethical. So I must say that the interviews were tremendously sad. I think everybody cried during their interviews. The pain they had experienced, the disappointment. They had come to be sent by their parents and their churches to be in Reading to be changed and cured, and nothing had happened to them. As a matter of fact, the opposite had happened, because these were Christian people who were struggling always not to be gay, and yet they were gay. And they, for the first time, got to know other gay people. And some of them had romances with other counselees there. And the remarkable thing was that many of them who went there to be changed ended up accepting their sexuality, their homosexuality. So this was just an amazing set of interviews. And for me, the most painful interviews that I've ever done. and I've done thousands and thousands of interviews. Sometime just before I was doing those interviews, there had been a red flag go up, and I found out about it. Colin had travelled to different Homosexuals Anonymous chapters to be at their meetings, and he went to one in Seattle. And while he was in Seattle, he met with one of the members of the chapter, and they had one of these naked prayer sessions together. Again, sexual stuff happened. And after it was over, the guy felt very bad about it and reported it to the person who ran the chapter. And she was so upset that she got together with the head of Exodus International, and the two of them came down to Reading and insisted on meeting with the board. Now, the board included Duncan Eva. He was the chair of the board, the special assistant to Neil Wilson. And it included an Adventist pastor there and some other people. And somehow or other, the whole thing was, Colin explained it all, and they believed him, and the whole thing was whitewashed over. But it was clearly a red flag that had gone up, but nothing had happened on that occasion. But what was I going to do with my abundance of data? Getting this information was a very large problem for me, because I was in the middle of this large study of Adventism. I was scared that if I told people what I'd found, there would be a blame the messenger syndrome, and that this might affect my access for the rest of my study. But I felt I had to do it, because how could one let this sort of thing continue? So I decided to write a letter. This was in consultation with my friends at Kinship, and one person who was very important in this, in advising me, was Larry Halleck. He deserves that recognition. He helped me write the letter, and he persuaded me to put much more data into the letter. It ended up being a page, I think it was 19 pages typed, with lots of quotations from interviews in detail. And then I was advised to send it not only to Neil Wilson, because Neil Wilson had a reputation for getting letters like that and then putting it in the bottom drawer and forgetting about it. So I sent it also to 29 other leading Adventists, mostly academics, so that there would be people who would pressure Wilson to act. And within 2 days of Neil receiving that letter, Colin was fired. And the funding that came from the General Conference and the Columbia Union to Quest stopped. But they decided instead to fund Homosexuals Anonymous, because they were assuming that Colin would no longer lead that. Now, so the whole thing, the Quest program in Reading collapsed. But it was only a few months later that there was an article in Ministry magazine. Bob Spangler, who was the editor, was a real fan of Colin, and he thought homosexuality was a huge problem, and that if we said you can't change, well, where was the Christian message as far as he was concerned? You had to be able to change. And so he wanted to believe Colin. And so he had these, it went on, there were several articles, and it went on for pages, many pages, in an issue of Ministry magazine, where it mentioned that Colin had had a problem, didn't say what it was, but where Colin had the chance to say, I'm now totally over my homosexuality and I'm starting counselling again. But nothing much more happened in Reading. And it was 2 or 3 years later that Colin surfaced again, this time in Denver, Colorado, where he went there and he got help no longer from the Adventists. Why, I forgot to say one important thing. So, I'm sorry I can't do anything about my phone. I just got to let it ring. Just a moment, I'll let this finish. One more ring. Sorry about that. The ministry had said that, but nothing was said by insight, nothing was said by the review. In other words, Adventists did not learn that Colin had a problem. They did not learn about all the abuse that had taken place. As far as they were concerned, he was still the answer to homosexuality. And Colin goes to Denver. He doesn't have the support of the General Conference anymore. He now has the financial support of Focus on the Family, of Dobson, a very well-known evangelical, very conservative evangelical. And there he was the answer for them to homosexuality. And he started doing the same sort of thing, his counseling and his seminars and so forth. By the way, about the time he went there, he was also starting to make inroads into the church. For example, he was invited to PUC for a weekend where he was the speaker. And he was a Sabbath school teacher at the big church in Denver. So he was starting to be re-accepted, and people didn't know. And Adventists were among those who went to him in Denver for help. And when 2 of those were abused again, they contacted me because they'd heard about the stories of what had happened before. So they came to me and they said, "What can we do?" And I heard really detailed stories from them, same sort of sad material. But one of them was in a different situation. He was doing counseling from a distance. So his was phone counseling. And because he wanted to be really work the program and be most successful, increase his chances of success, he recorded the sessions with Colin in the hope of listening to them again and getting a double blessing. Well, he presented me with those tapes, and there was tremendous evidence of crazy stuff happening. Lauren's article told one of the stories where he was asked the most personal questions about his masturbatory habits, in most intimate details, and it turned out that Colin was masturbating while he heard the answers. It was very sad, and so eventually I didn't know what to do. This was not a situation where I could write to Neil Wilson, and I didn't know Dobson. So what I did was to contact the Denver Post, and the religion editor had spent a lot of time with me, but then she said, "I'm going to check this out for myself." And she went and did interviews with the same people, and then with more. And then they published front page story. And that was the end of the funding from a Focus on the Family for Colin. But he's never stopped his counseling, as far as I know. The one last story about Colin. I had a friend in Denver. Colin knew her too, but he didn't know that she and I were friends. She was a writer. And after the second blow up in Denver, his very patient wife gave up on him and left him and then divorced him. And to Colin, that was the end. That was the worst thing that could happen, because he always used the existence of his wife and his two boys as proof of his change of orientation. Nonsense, of course. Well, Colin approached our mutual friend and asked her to help him find another woman so that he could have a wife to point to in his programs. And she told me about it. It was a very sad story overall, because most of the victims were disappointed. They were abused. And then there was Colin's wife with her miserable experience with him. And perhaps worst, the two boys growing up in that sort of situation. It must have been extraordinarily difficult for them to grow up in such a family, where Colin would talk about the size of his boy's penis to the people he was counselling with. I understand that both the boys have had serious problems, and one at least has been in prison. That is how sad the whole situation can become. But what I want to finish with is saying this. Because the Adventist church leaders continue to refuse to accept that LGBTQ people can be Christians, and they can refuse to accept kinship as a ministry that's really doing remarkable stuff. And they instead continue to publicize ex-gay ministries. Ted Wilson's favorite one is now Coming Out Ministries. Ted did one thing which no General Conference president had done before. He had a conference about homosexuality. It was in Cape Town, fairly early in his period as president. The only gay people he mentioned, who he invited, were the members of Coming Out Ministries. Nobody else was invited, and somebody from Coming Out Ministries got the opportunity to speak at that conference. When I lived in North Carolina, they came to my church. They came to the conference. They came to the two academies, one private, the other church academy in Asheville. And they told their stories. And they've all got the same sort of story. They're not much younger than me. And their stories are ones of wild promiscuity and drug addiction and alcohol addiction. Miserable, miserable stories. And when they tell these personal stories, they say that this is the typical gay story. And that's absolutely not true. We live in a time, it was miserable for me growing up because I didn't know the answers either. But now we have a situation where there's a lot of emphasis upon gay relationships, upon gay families, upon adopting or having children. This is not the sort of problems that these people found themselves in 50 years ago. But those are the ones who the church is using as role models, and their stories are being told as the gay story. I find it really sad that this is what the church is continuing to do. I find it really sad what we've seen in Colin. Lauren wrote a really good article last week about this. You've got two headline issues that both involve gay people in the last few weeks. One is a pastor in Germany who came out to his congregation his congregation want him to continue where he's been already for many years. And the conference says, yes, you've done nothing wrong. We want you to continue to be a pastor. But the General Conference and the division have turned against him. So we'll see what happens. On the other hand, we have the situation in Uganda where they've passed a law where if you really say you're gay, you've got life imprisonment. And if you do other things, you can be killed, death penalty. And the General Conference has said nothing about that. Where is our love? Where is our relevance to the issues? To what extent are we following the example of Jesus in accepting the outcasts? That's my story.
Thank you, Ron. That's just, as somebody said here, these stories just do my head in. I mean, I've heard you tell this story before, and it still moves me to tears every time. I just have such a hard time understanding how my church could be that irresponsible, where the pastoral sense of pastoral care was in all of this. Let me ask you a couple things that occurred to me. And by the way, this is a good time if you want to join the conversation, if you want to ask Ron some questions. Remember, we are recording it because I feel like this is a historical recording for the sake of sort of the archives of the church. But I do want to ask you this, something I didn't understand, this notion of I'm giving a testimony that I'm ex-gay on the basis of faith, but I don't have to act upon it. I don't quite understand how that works. That doesn't really compute for me. Are they saying that I'm anticipating God taking it away eventually so I can do what I want to until then? I don't quite get it.
I think Colin's approach is theology, because he put a lot of emphasis on faith, was you take the change by faith. And of course the example he was showing was just that, you know. He claimed he'd been changed, and yet here he was having all the sexual activity with the people he was counseling. And so they were saying, we're taking it by faith. And they gave their testimonies as if that was true, because somehow they believed it was true, even though he'd been to the gay bar and spent a night with someone the night before. It doesn't make any sense to me, but that's, I think, what was going on.
That's astonishing. Before we go on, let me just say, there are a number of articles right now.
I'm going to go to the bathroom for a minute. Is that okay?
Yeah, no problem. There's a couple of announcements we need to make anyway, but yeah, I understand. It's a long time to sit for us old guys. Let me just say a couple of things here. Would you be so kind, all of you who are concerned about this story, go to our website. We have published a number of articles on these topics, including, you should know that the statement that the General Conference issued last week or the week before, but recently, on Sasha's situation, took language straight from Coming Out Ministries. The notion that unless you can claim that God has done the impossible and changed you from gay to straight, you really can't claim salvation. You do not understand the gospel. You can't claim salvation. Floyd, is one of the most cruel things that I've ever seen written down. Does that assume that all of these men standing in their suits there have all become perfect? They can claim salvation because they've overcome their tempers and their lusts and everything else that human flesh is heir to. But I do want you to go there, read the most recent stories, the one that we just put up yesterday, naming a task force. And again, in naming this task force on human sexuality, Ted Wilson again used the notion of gay change. He again said that God has to be able to change you. This is cruelty, Floyd. And it breaks my heart. Coming Out Ministries, Sue, is a ministry led by Wayne Blakely and another chap whose name I'm not remembering right.
Michael Carducci, Ron
Michael
Woolsey.
Carducci, yeah. And they are kind of going on this faith thing too, that you can claim that you are no longer gay and God is going to take it away. And this ministry has been strongly embraced by the General Conference. A few years ago, I was at a General Conference Executive Committee meeting, which happens twice a year, spring and autumn, at the General Conference, where people come in from all over the world. And I looked up from where I was sitting at the press table, and here was Ted leading to the platform, Wayne Blakely. And in fact, Wayne got up and made his presentation that was denying that he was gay any longer. Well, there is evidence that has not been the case either, but I'm not going to get into that. But what a sad, sad story. But please go to the website, read some of these pieces. I also posted, several people posted the original piece on Ron's website, as well as a piece on that we more. I think I kind of broke it down and summarized it and made it a little shorter. But it's also an Adventist today, and I posted the link to that too. We have been following this for years, and we're deeply grateful to Ron and to Floyd for providing us with opportunities to talk to people and to get this documentation. And we need to keep talking about this because it is hurting so many people. So Linda, Ron, are you back?
Yes.
Okay, Linda, I'm gonna ask you to unmute and join this conversation.
Thank you. Dr. Lawson, I just want to express to you, which I'm sure reflects the feelings of most, if not all of us, the gratitude that we feel for your willingness to be vulnerable with us today. This cannot be an easy story to tell, and I just want to express my personal appreciation for it. But I have to say, as someone who has a background in counseling, as heinous as this Colin Cook's activities were, and to the extent to which he took advantage of people, men particularly, who are homosexual, the thing that strikes me is that this person is a sexual predator. Irrespective of his sexual orientation, he is a sexual predator. I can envision similar types of circumstances that have occurred with people like him who are heterosexual. It doesn't make it any better, but the reason I mention that is that it surprises me that he was able to ingratiate himself to the extent that he apparently did with various levels of conference officials. And so it also strikes me that in addition to being a sexual predator, he is also a grifter, because he must be I've never met him, but he must be a very convincing person. And so I don't know if you would like to comment on either of those two things, but I have one actual question, and that is, what is your opinion and your take, as Lauren mentioned, on this new human sexuality task force that is going to seek support from the Biblical Research Institute, which boggles the mind. I wonder if you have comments on that, what you think it will mean, who do you think it will affect, and what's going to happen as a result of this?
Well, that's quite a kettle of fish there, Linda. First of all, your comment on Colin, I got a real sense, the way I appreciated his Sabbath school class back in 1971 was showed me, well, he had a good brain, and his understanding of the gospel warmed my heart. So I left there. Then, as far as I was concerned, the best thing that happened to me that day in church was the Sabbath school class that I attended. With regard to the task force, it breaks my heart, because it just simply shows that we're in a situation where the church doesn't want to listen to anything that's new. It wants to keep on reaffirming the prejudices that it has had all along, and more so, as a matter of fact. Basically, the history of Adventism and LGBT people is, when I grew up, I never heard a sermon against homosexuality. Never, when I was growing up. But my sense of that this was bad came from society, from the jokes that were told, from the bullying that happened at school, those sort of things. But I put two and two together myself, thinking that the church doesn't say anything, but it probably thinks this is very bad. And that's why I turned to God to try to change. It was only after we became active, and we became active because we'd had such terrible experiences trying not to be gay, that the church suddenly said, oops, we've got some people. They'd always assumed that we didn't exist in their number, but we're here in large numbers. And they've turned strongly against homosexuality since kinship was created. And this continues. And there's no attempt to understand, no attempt to talk to us. I've never had a serious conversation about being gay with a church leader. They just make their assumptions and away they go. So it's a pretty sad story all along, as far as I'm concerned. I'm sad that they've gone and appointed this committee.
I think it's important to say, Ron, no, this is not a tribute to the courage of any of these people, but I did receive some messages after I posted my piece from people who said, I did not sign on to that. And even though I was pictured there in a suit with the rest of them, it wasn't presented that way. And I know these people well enough to know that that's the case. There are people in these upper levels of the church organization and also in conferences and unions who have gay children and love them. And but there's not much courage there to stand up and say, I disagree with you. Floyd, I'm going to let Brian and Judy go before you, just because they have to leave. They've got another appointment, and I want to make sure that they get in on this, because Brian and Judy are also part of our kinship advisor committee too, I think, aren't you?
Yes,
Yeah.
yes.
Yeah, jump in here, Judy.
I just wanted to say something. Thank you so much. I'm very touched by, you sharing some things, which I know a number of times as I've heard you and read what you have written, it's touched me so much, your honesty in sharing this and you grappling with these things. I also am a therapist and work mostly at this point in my career with young people. And something that keeps coming up is parents who say things like, I would rather have my child be dead than have them be gay, because then they think that their child will never be able to be in heaven. And so they are desperate for an answer, for some way to change their child back and make them not be gay. So they're very, very susceptible to this idea that there could be a change ministry and somehow they could send their child to be fixed so that they will be in heaven. And there's just so many heartbreaking problems with this, because one, where are parents hearing this? Where are they learning this? And many of them, when I do get a chance to talk to parents, are saying they hear this in their Adventist churches, that their child, if their child is gay, they cannot go to heaven. They would be better off dead. They are hearing this in their churches. And it's making me less and less feel like I want to be an Adventist anymore, because I'm like, someone has seriously lost their way here. And on the other hand, when you actually get to talk with parents, they actually don't really want their children to be dead. They love their children. They want help to learn, how do we support, how do we help our child through this? What do we do? They actually are really longing for and yearning for some kind of support and help with this, but they grab the first thing that's offered to them, and they often the first thing they get offered is a change ministry thing, or you can go and talk to this person and they will fix your kid. And parents grab that because they feel like, I don't know what else to do. I have to do something. And so I think parents are also in a very vulnerable position. And it's why I'm so supportive of things like kinship and other things that actually can help parents navigate this process with their kids, and they don't have to say stupid things like, I wish you were dead rather than gay, because I don't need to tell you that is not a helpful thing for our young people to hear.
Judy, I just want to add something that I think I heard you say. I'm also on the kinship advisory committee, and at our last meeting in Glendale, I think you were talking about the fact that there's an extremely high rate of suicide among young gay people in fundamentalist churches who don't know how to handle what's going on, and that's something we need to talk about too. I mean, this is astonishing. Would our church really say, no, I'd rather have you commit suicide than be who you are?
You can't be gay, and we'd rather you be dead than be gay. What are young people supposed to do? We want them to be alive and be healthy and to have healthy relationships. At least I do. And I'm trusting that most of you here today do as well. I have such a burden that be what they're hearing, is that we want them to be alive and welcomed and included. And I totally believe that's actually what God wants too.
Yeah, Ron, I'm sorry I interrupted you there, but join back in here again.
Yes, I'd like to, Judy, I think your point was very good. And it reminded me back a few years ago when the NAD, the North American Division, was decided to have a book on treating Guiding Families. It was called Guiding Families, wasn't it? And I talked to the people who had played important roles in that book, and it was explained to me that they realized this is the North American division, sadly not the General Conference, but the NAD, which is different in some important ways from the GC, realized that they had this problem because so often if a child came out and they were at college, the parents would suddenly refuse to pay their tuition, or would treat them very badly in other ways, and they did this. For example, they cut them off from the family.
Yeah,
and they did that. I was told because they thought that that's what the church wanted them to do. And somehow that message is out there. But the NAD, in doing this book, was setting out to say, no, our guidance is something else. And it was much more working with your kids and accepting them. And I found that a remarkable book, except for the last page where they went and put the official GC position.
when I gave out copies of the book, I tore out the last page.
I love that. Yeah, when the NAD did that position in 2015, a lot of people were disappointed that they didn't go farther. But I had to say, having been around in ministry for a while and watching this whole thing, just the fact that they admitted that there is such a thing as an orientation was like light years ahead of what I expected. So I used that as when I was a pastor. I ignored the part about whether they're in a relationship or not, but I said, hey, the NAD said if you've got that orientation, you can be a church member, and just went with it. Judy, thank you so much. I appreciate you and Brian so much and your support of kinship. And I'm going to
Thank you. We have to go and pick up Brian's mom, so we're going to check out here, but thank you all, and thank you so much, Ron.
Ron is a hero. Thank you. And I'm going to now go on to another hero, and that is my friend Floyd. Floyd, I appreciate you so much, and as a friend and as the ministry that you're doing. Talk to us a little bit.
Thanks, Lauren. No hero, that's for sure, but very passionate. Ron, it's good to see you here. Thanks for sharing this important story, and thanks, Lauren, for giving us a platform to be able to share this. It's not only a historic story, incident, whatever. The sad thing is it's still happening today. Back then it was with Colin Cook as a physical act. Today it's from Ted Wilson as a mental act, mental abuse, in that he will refuses to talk with the community, get to know us, understand us, because none of us are gay because we choose to be rebellious to God and we just want to get back at God. That's not the story. So unfortunately, it's still continuing. And I'm not even going to say the GC. Because I take responsibility for what kinship says and does. I go straight to Ted and put the blame on his shoulders for not instigating that. I have a quick observation and then a question for Ron. The observation is in the past, growing up, whenever I was told that God can change you. If you have just enough faith, God can make you straight, make you normal, make you whatever. I don't hear that as much anymore. The rhetoric has changed from, because we believe we were born this way with this feeling, this inside of us. Now it's a choice that we made, is what is coming from Coming Out Ministries. And that, God is kind of taken out of the equation. He can help us modify our behavior. But the thing is that most of us have now studied the clobber texts as they've become known, and we no longer see them as condemning us. So we see no reason to want to change our behavior. And We accept that we're just part of God's plan somehow along the way, and we don't know the answers to that, but we do know that God loves us. So, you know, it's feels a little strange to have the GC have Ted take God out of the equation of this whole story. So that's my observation. But then my question for Ron is, during that first meeting, that first camp meeting, we had 5 professors and pastors, and then we had Colin Cook. What was the dynamic during that week of them being together? I believe the 5 pastors were there to learn about us and hear our stories, hear where we're coming from, and then report back to the GC with their findings, whereas Colin had an agenda, I believe. So what was the dynamic between those leaders, those pastors during that week there?
From what I remember, let me put it this way. When I invited them, the 3 seminarians had not ever thought their way through the issue at all, but they were willing to do so for the camp meeting, in advance of the camp meeting. The 2 pastors both had, because one had a gay brother, and the other one had already had a gay couple in her church, and who she had come to terms with and baptized. So the pastors were in a different situation, but the seminarians were new to the topic. But they really did their homework, and then they learnt enormously from the camp meeting. For example, we were nervous about starting with the clergy. We called them the clergy. So we invited them to come on the second day of the camp meeting. So we arrived on whatever day it was, and I think it was a Monday. And let's say Monday night, we were there with no particular program, and no one had planned for that night. And so I came up with the idea: why don't we tell our stories to each other? What it was like growing up as an Adventist. And this was really the worst night of horror stories I've ever heard. It became an institution in camp meeting, with the new people each time telling their stories. But that time it was everybody telling their stories. And those stories were really horrendous. The violence against us and things like that. And if you want to look at some of them, I was asked to summarize those, and I gave 12 examples from my memory for an article in Spectrum magazine, probably about 1984. It doesn't have my name on it. I had to do it anonymously. Roy Branson insisted on that, but I was the one who did it, and so you can see what some of the stories were like if you want to look at that magazine. But those were such an overwhelming experience, hearing those stories, that whoever picked them up at the airport must have told them about them on the way up. And they asked for us to do the whole thing again that very first night. And we did. And the stories did, and they were changes, but it was a remarkable night. And and they cried with us. And so and by the end of the week, they were saying what I reported, that God accepts you. He calls you to a relationship with commitment. Colin was sort of there, but he wasn't in on the councils that I'm aware of that they had with each other when they were discussing. And this, he didn't have the standing apparently, and his meeting became fairly adversarial with some of the kinship members, because we'd been struggling so long to change, to be told you've got to change was just rubbing salt into the wound, or maybe pepper. So Colin was sort of he did his one meeting. He tried to talk to people, but he was clearly out of place. That was the way it worked out.
Thanks, Ron.
Thank you so much, Floyd. I'm going to move on. It looks like Bjorn Carlman is the next one on the list. Bjorn, would you unmute and join the conversation?
Yeah, thanks. I think I'm unmuted now. Thank you, Ron, for a deeply meaningful presentation. I grew up as a missionary kid, and I would say I don't know about homophobic, but I certainly wasn't really as knowledgeable about the LGBTQ sort of the lifestyle and various questions that came up until I had a gay roommate at Andrews for a couple years, and we were really, really good friends. I think I shared this at a previous ATSS. And he, it was obvious to me from knowing him that he was being honest, in that he had been gay for as long as he could remember. It was certainly not a decision on his part. His dad was a pastor. His dad taught at the seminary, and he had wanted so badly not to be gay because of all this rhetoric, that he had to change. And he said to me very sincerely, I think he was in tears, that he just wanted to know where he stood with God. And it was heartbreaking stuff. I wanted to have answers for him, and I didn't have answers other than, God is merciful, God is good, I don't know, that kind of thing, So it was very clear to me that he had been that way his entire time, and I respected that story because the narrative rang true. So when I met Michael Carducci a few months ago, he came over to the Newbold area. I put in the chat for Coming Out Ministries, and I talked to him about this, and I challenged him a number of times because someone wanted me to meet with him, and it struck me that in contrast with someone like Colin Cook, the point has been made that Colin Cook was obviously a sexual predator. In some ways, you could say this guy, it was kind of an edged case scenario. It probably would be unfair to say that because Colin Cook was a predator and was abusive, his kind of ministry is abusive. I'm not sure. How do you interact with someone like Michael Carducci? And we don't have to personalize it, but how do you talk to people that say sincerely that they really have changed? Do you tell them, no, you haven't? You know what I mean? Like, you have to kind of respect their narrative as well. And can it be that people seek spiritual peace from different paths? And one of them is that they have to sort of fight their inclinations, just like someone that, decides to be celibate goes that way. I don't know. I have a really hard time knowing how to deal with ministries like Coming Out Ministries. I don't want to call them predatory or abusive because I feel like that's not fair to their narrative, even though I strongly disagree with it. How would you interact with those kinds of entities while respecting their stories?
Well, I had a somewhat different experience. Let me tell you my experience with Coming Out Ministries. This reminds me, I also have a personal story which I should also tell. But anyway, when I lived in Asheville, North Carolina, as I said in my presentation, they were invited by the conference, and they were spending obviously 2 or 3 weeks in the conference, and especially a long time around Asheville, because that's where a lot of the Adventists are. There's 16 or 18 churches around Asheville, and 2 academies and a hospital. and they came to the church I was attending, which was Asheville North, which was a difficult situation for me, because I had been told that by the pastor that because I was gay, I was welcome to attend, but that I should never attempt to bring my membership there because they would refuse to accept it.
Oof.
So that was a difficult situation for me to be in, and I tended to sit alone in church services. I felt really quite alone there. And then suddenly these people from Coming Out Ministries come there for a weeknight meeting, and the church is full to hear them. And they're telling what I remember them saying was, we have not stopped having our gay feelings, but we are changed. We do not behave like gay anymore, and we do not do the other things which we associate with being gay, which means getting drunk and high on drugs. So it was sort of a testimony of change in those sorts of ways, and and if they've changed in those sort of ways, who am I to question them? That's fine. Good. And thanks be to God. But from our experience, certainly from mine, I prayed and prayed and prayed, and nothing happened, and cried, and it was just it was very disruptive to my life. That somehow I was still doing things at university, but I obviously was slowed down by all this stuff. And this is where I come to mention my own personal experience. At one point when I was in my mid-20s, I went to the counselling office at the University of Queensland in Australia, where I was doing my PhD. And I said to the head counsellor, who used to be professor of psychology, that I was having all these gay feelings and I really didn't want to have them. How can I be changed? And he was a bit nonplussed about what to do. And he said, well, we've really only got one thing to offer you, and that's aversion therapy. And aversion therapy involved sitting in a dark room, there's a screen, and slides are shown. And if it's a slide, and they tend to be of naked men and women. If it was a naked woman, nothing happened. If it was a naked man, I received a small electric shock. And that was supposed to change my orientation. That was about as effective as Colin Cook's program. It made me get very upset.
Of course.
And I stood it for about 6 weeks. And then I just simply said, I'm not coming anymore. So yes, there's some secular versions of this out there too, but if somebody tells me he's changed orientation, all I can say is that's not my experience, and it's not the experience of a lot of my friends, and we've all struggled for years. But if you've had a different experience, that's your experience. I can't get inside your skin, so I can't say more than that.
Thanks for the answer.
Yeah, Bjorn, as long as you're on here, could you mention, I hate to interrupt the flow of the conversation, but could you mention, we are still in our spring fundraiser, and you had mentioned to me that we still have money left on our matching fund.
We do. I was gonna say it at the end because I didn't want to kind of break the flow here, but it goes towards supporting this kind of a platform where we can say this. I mean, you try to say this in most other Adventist forums, you're just not going to have a voice. Yep, about $10,000 or just over 10 to 11 of matching funds generously donated to matching challenge. So every dollar you give is double up to that number this month. So please give to support this kind of ministry. It means a lot to be able to have open, meaningful conversations and to have people like Ron here. So thank you everyone. I'll keep it there.
Can I say something more about in answer to Bjorn? One thing I didn't mention is that when I was struggling, the whole struggle was within myself, between me and reaching out to God.
Mm-hmm.
I told no one.
Yeah.
I couldn't tell my parents I have this terrible problem, because what would they have done? It would have just brought them sadness. I dated women, but I didn't want to have any hanky panky with them. I wasn't interested in that. But if I went to a concert, I would ask a girl, because that's what you did. And several of them said, "But you never looked like you want." They looked upon me as a sort of a good catch, and the fact that I was inviting them, but I'd invite a different girl the next time and a different girl the next time. I was, of course, trying to avoid relationships, but to have friendships. And it turns out that gay men are very good at having friendships with women, because there's no sexual tension at all. But in those days they sensed that. So yes, I was keeping the whole thing within myself, hiding it, and this honesty which you see from me today is a result of me coming out. That allows me to be honest with everything in the world, and so I'm totally changed as a result of that. And so if people tell me that they've been changed, I don't say I believe you, because they may be kidding themselves or they may be pretending. But on the other hand, I don't say you're a liar. I don't know.
Bjorn, thank you for mentioning matching fund. I won't put you on the spot and ask you to tell the funny ending to the story with your gay roommate that you told me one time.
Well, okay. I'll step out on a limb, but I was a little bit homophobic, so I was then concerned about whether or not he was attracted to me, because this was very new territory for me. So I asked him, I was like, "Hey, you're not attracted to me, are you?" And he was like, "Oh, no, trust me, no." And then, I was immediately offended. I was hold on a second. Yeah, and I don't think I said that, but that was my reaction, and it's still funny to me to this day.
It's interesting, Bjorn. I had a, not to your last story, but I had an interesting. I had a similar thing. I had a good friend who was gay, and I came from a very conservative Adventist family, way out in the middle of North Dakota, not liberal in any way. But I do remember, and I actually thank the grace of God for this. He was such a great guy. I really, really loved him as a friend. And when I realized that he was gay, I somehow in my brain, it calculated as, I liked him when I didn't know he was gay. Why should I like him any less that he is, now that I know he is gay? And why should it bother me? And somehow I got through that without a lot of trauma. And it put me on the road to being accepting of gay people. And I still like him to this day. Part of it, I think, is, I guess I felt very strongly that I knew I liked girls and I wasn't attracted to him, and I assumed he wasn't attracted to me, but I still like him as my friend. And I've often said since, and I've heard some of you say this too, once you know people who are different than you as friends, when you know them as real people, you get past prejudices. And I can't tell you how many families I've known who were anti-gay until they had a child or grandchild who identified as gay, and suddenly they have to open their hearts in a different way, and it is true.
Changes things.
Yeah. So Nathan Hilton. Nathan, I'm so glad that you're here. Join in. I'm asking you to unmute and go ahead and join this conversation. Thanks for coming.
Well, thank you. Thank you as well for allowing me to ask also a question that I have. And Ronald as well, thank you so much for all your scholarship, for all the time you have put into addressing all these many questions that we have and that the church has not been doing a good job in answering. My question to you is, what do you think perhaps is the afterlife of these questions within the church, or of this debate within the church? As someone who has dealt with this for the past 40 years, when I first read the story with Colin Cook, I was frustrated with the fact that the church had not done more, but with the fact that this had happened so many years ago. And there is not many efforts done today by people within the church structure to change the system that allowed this to happen in the first place. I think that if there was or there are any other Colin Cooks in the church, we wouldn't know it, because the church is still protecting certain types of discourse that do not help LGBTQ plus people, but rather maintain the church's positions still in the same place that were, 40 years ago. So I wanted to know what is your opinion in regards to how the church might move in the future. I think that many young people today are not having, I think, the same reactions people were having in the past, because we have more access to information, because there's a lot of scholarship, including your own, which just allowed us to know what has been happening in the church. But I still feel that the leadership of the church is still very, closed and opening itself to learning and to hearing our stories and to hearing how we experience these things. As someone who studied theology also at Andrews, I know that this is not something we ever covered, not from the biblical part. We kind of did a bit, but not the human aspect of it. We never actually met or discussed this at length when it came to queer lives in the church and how we have been affected by the discourse the church has been kind of sharing for all this time. So as someone who has seen this kind of develop, right, like in this last 40 years, what do you think is perhaps the afterlife of this debate? Do you think this is going to happen change anytime soon? Or do you think it's going to take a while for the church to ever open itself? Because I don't think, the world can, continue this way. At least the church can continue, being so close-minded, because the world is changing. And I think they have to realize this at some point. But I wanted to hear your opinion as someone who has been dealing with this for a long time.
Well, thank you, Nathan. I think that's a very important question, and there's a fair bit to it. Let me have a go. You happen to be asking this question of somebody who's spent the last 30 years of his life studying the dynamics from a sociological point of view of the Adventist church around the world, and I've done interviews in 60 countries. It's a number of things to say. First of all, I've got, I'm actually writing 4 books, and I hope I live long enough to finish them. The second volume is about the church and social issues, and in every one of those issues, the church, if we're seeing it from the point of view of the official General Conference church, has not done a very satisfactory job at all, and that's putting it mildly. Just consider women. Women's issue has been around in strength since the 1970s, and here we are 50 years later, and it's still pretty much where it was. Not too much change. there's been changes in some respects, but the official position is largely still very conservative on all sorts of issues or social issues. On the other hand, this is not true when you get closer to the grassroots. And I think in this respect, I want to quote Lauren. Lauren thinks that we should, and I agree with him, that we've really got to put a lot of emphasis when we think of the church. I think of it as our congregations, and oftentimes it can be the lower levels of the church too. At the moment, the one chance we had of good change in my time at the General Conference level was during Jan Paulsen's presidency, because he truly was a more open person, but he was also too scared of having division in the church, and so that was a huge problem. He didn't do the things that he should have done while he had the opportunity. And then after him, we get Ted, and we're back in the dark ages with Ted, I'm afraid. But let me tell you about some examples of different changes that I've run into. The most outstanding is this. I was, about the year 2000, I was asked to come to the Netherlands to talk to them for a weekend about how to handle their changing racial situation. And it was a white church which was rapidly changing with an influx of immigrants, especially from the Dutch West Indies, from Curacao and so forth. And they were heading rapidly towards becoming the majority, and they were much more conservative. So the white church was a very liberal church by and large. The immigrant church was much more conservative, and the people who were running the church were scared that the church was going to become more conservative and make it difficult. And the day before the meeting started, I was taken by one of the pastors. He was the youth leader, on a tour of various things, churches and institutions. And the most striking thing from my point of view was seeing the camp, the youth camp. The youth camp was a beautiful setting. It had very, very nice buildings, and it had 3 different kinds of housing. It had housing for married couples. It had housing for singles. Who was the third? Anyway, there were different kinds of housing, and he just volunteered to me that if couples have been living together, and everywhere in the Western world, people are living together before they marry, whether they're heterosexual or, of course, LGBT. And it's difficult to believe that Adventists are not doing the same thing. And in the Netherlands, they were certainly doing the same thing. He said, if they're living together, we count them as married, and they can live together at the camp, whether they're straight or gay. And he said, and he explained, he said, if we say no to them, they can leave the church. He said, if we say yes to them, they're going to put their roots down in the church, and they're going to be the next generation in the church. Now, I think that's absolute wisdom about the way the world, the church is working. But the brethren at the top of the church in the General Conference, it hasn't occurred to them. When I'm asked about what's going on in the future of the church, my last chapter is the future of the church. I can say a great deal, but let us just simply limit to this. In the Western world, everywhere in the United States, Canada, Europe, Australia, New Zealand, the church is declining. The average age of an Adventist in North America is somewhere around about 60 now. In other words, well past childbearing years. And the youth we've got, we're losing, because the youth can't see the relevance of the church. And one of the reasons they can't see the relevance is the social issues. I think this is the most important issue to the youth. If we can't treat women the same as we treat men, if we can't welcome LGBT members, etc., if we can't handle our racial problems, if we're going to the most common reason for disfellowshipping around the world is some woman who gets pregnant before she's married. It's a sure ticket in most places to being disfellowshipped. This shows how irrelevant the church is to understanding, and the youth know this. And until the church if the church doesn't change, it's going to go down the hill. And it's not only in the Western world that it's changing. There's a very interesting book just come out a few months ago. It's a dissertation become a book on Nigeria. And the church in Nigeria is changing dramatically. And if it's changing in Africa, it's changing everywhere, folks. And I know that it's changing in South America too. So it's not just here that it's changing. So if we cannot deal with these issues, it's going to be goodbye Adventism. God will have to find others to be his church. So that's the best I can do in my answer to you.
Nathan, thank you very much. That was a meaningful question and a meaningful answer. Before I go on, let me just mention something to you. I always try to throw this little advertisement in because it's.
Can I go to the bathroom?
Oh yes, yeah. And while Ron is gone, let me mention, for those of you who are troubled by the biblical issues, the best book that's out there right now is by our friend Alicia Johnston. And she does a really good job on the clobber texts. And in particular, she really handles what we need to do. And so I'm going to post this right here there you go. It's in the chat. You can click on that and go, and everybody who has read the book has just really felt that it was very meaningful and helpful, because even from the point of view of being a biblicist, you can make a pretty good case that the Bible does not damn gay people. And so you don't have to just say, well, I don't believe the Bible anymore because I want gay people to be accepted. The Bible is not that clear on this issue. And on the issue of excluding gay people. And so, Floyd, you know what I'm talking about here. And I think, I don't think Alicia's here, but I did want to put that in for Emmanuel. Would you join this conversation, my friend?
Yes, good afternoon. Ron, it's a pleasure to see you again. This reminds me of our meeting at Columbia University. I am going to ask you two questions. The first one, I would like to ask you to take your crystal ball and to look and to tell us the future, keeping in mind that we have a new pastor at Andrews and a new president. How do you see this discussion at the Biblical Research Institute in Washington, D.C. through your crystal ball? Now, my second question is a legal question. it seems that the church has a fiduciary duty. Do we have any kind of litigation because the church was not up to its fiduciary duty and some kind of abuse took place with the brother you talk about?
You're talking about the Colin Cook in that question, is it?
Yeah, we can hear you, Rob. Emmanuel?
And I'm not sure I got the second question.
Yeah, Emmanuel, say it again.
Yes, I was telling you, the church has a fiduciary duty, and with all that took place, do we have any kind of people trying to make them person whole all over again, looking for reparation by taking the stuff to court?
Okay, I've got your story now. Thank you. All right. First of all, your first question about what can we do? What can we expect of this committee that's just been formed, and can we expect anything good to come out of it? I'm pretty not very hopeful about the situation at the General Conference at all these days. One of the things that I noticed, and maybe some of you else noticed this, remember back when the General Conference met in the middle of last year, Ted Wilson gave the Sabbath sermon, one of his typical sermons, hold fast, right? Hold fast to everything you've got. And he went through how many things, 30 or 40. And one of them dealt with sexuality. And I was very taken aback by the fact that his point against us at the in his sermon was cheered by sections of the audience, but that on the stage, and we could see everybody on the stage, no one clapped, with two exceptions. The people who clapped, one clapped very loudly and very long, and the other one was his wife, who joined because he was clapping. And the person who did the clapping was the person who used to be the president of the South American division, who's now the General Conference secretary, and who's apparently the heir apparent to Ted. So that indicated to me that, well, it confirmed, because I'd heard it before from my South American friends, that I'm forgetting his name, the man who's secretary.
Elton Kohler.
So again?
Elton Kohler.
That's it. Colin, I've heard from South America that he's very anti-gay, and there he was showing it by clapping. Very much, I'm the same as Ted. You know, I'm the coattails of Ted. So if he is in fact elected, I assume that Ted will resign or not be elected in 2 years' time when they have the next General Conference session. And if Kohler is the one who's takes over, it'll be more of the same. So that's, and then I don't know whether we all understand the way things work. When the nominating committee works at a General Conference, the first person to be chosen, and the key person to be chosen, is the president, of course. And thereafter, the president meets with the nominating committee and tells them who he wants in the positions. And Ted in particular likes yes men. He doesn't like people who are not yes men. And so you can be sure that the BRI is stacked with Ted's clones. and that the same way as the other positions. And indeed, if you don't fit his what he wants, you don't stay in the position. You go. There were two people who disagreed with him on women's ordination. They were vice presidents. They lasted one term in 2015, and they were out. It's the way TED works. So, what should we expect from the BRIs? I don't have anything in the way of hopes at all. The BRI does not include the best scholars. It's crazy. It includes people who will give the answers that the president wants.
Very interesting.
Oh, then the other question was, yes, with regard to the, there was a lot of damage done. What about suits? It so happened that totally apart from kinship, totally apart from me, at the time when I was interviewing at Quest, some of the Quest members had seen a lawyer and they were preparing to sue Colin Cook and the church over what happened. But it never happened. The suit never went through. They were wounded people, you know, and they just didn't get it together to bring it to culmination. It may have been partly the lawyer's fault, I don't know. But all I know is that there was a lot of talk. I heard about it, but it never came to anything. I don't know how long the statute of limitations would be now. It's been a long time. I suspect that it's too late.
I want to mention something that you have told me, Ron, and this surprised me. When Colin Cook's organization, Counseling Setting, was set up in Reading, Pennsylvania, you told me a lot of young men moved there to take part in this. And when the whole business fell apart, there were a number of them who had moved there and were stranded. Basically, they didn't want to go home because their church had said, oh, we're sending you to this church-approved counseling center where you're going to come back as a straight man. And they just ended up being stranded there, some of them working for minimum wage jobs, not able to really carry on anymore. And when I wrote that story up that you guys are commenting about, one of those people actually chimed in and said, yeah, I was one of those people who got stranded there. What a sad story.
Yes, I remember that. You got it exactly right.
Yeah, Floyd, thanks for coming back in here. By the way, I don't think I mentioned Floyd is the current president of Kinship and has been doing a wonderful job in ministering to people and helping them through. Floyd, join back in here again.
Yeah, thanks. I just wanted to reemphasize a thought about orientation, that if an orientation is actually changed, so we're talking about gay to straight, then if there's a true change, there's no more temptation for that old feeling. So anyone who says they're still having temptations or feelings, then their orientation hasn't changed, because I don't know too many people who are 100% heterosexual who daily have to fight gay sexual feelings when they wake up in the mornings. So we're talking about orientation and not behavior. Anybody can behave in a bad way or in a good way or whatever, but when you're actually, and that's what the GC doesn't understand, is the concept of an orientation, sadly. But I also want to give a little update on Colin Cook. Kathy Baldock, she's not an Adventist, she's a Christian writer who has taken upon herself to expose change ministries, et cetera, et cetera. She wrote a book, Walking the Bridgeless Canyon, and she's a co-author of the upcoming 1946 film, which I hope this group can talk about when it actually is widely available later this year. In preparation for that, Kathy is writing a second book, and there's a chapter there, or a big portion of the book, on change ministries and how that played into this whole scenario. And one of the chapters is actually about Adventism and Colin Cook, because Colin was one of the first people who helped issue or usher in, rather, this concept of being able to change one's orientation, and was kind of almost a co-founder or a predecessor to Exodus International, as was mentioned earlier. And so I helped her get in contact with Colin, and this was like right at the beginning of the pandemic, so 3 years ago, basically. And Colin finally agreed to give her an interview, as long as she didn't write it down, but she could share it verbally. And she, he went through the whole story, the whole thing, and her question was, "Are you straight?" And he said, "I still have daily temptations." And she says, "But you have this program that you've done for all these years. Why has it not worked on you?" And he didn't actually have an answer for that, but he stood by that his program, this, as Ron said, 14-step program that you do, actually does work if anyone actually would take the time and honestly work the program. They could change, but it hasn't worked for himself. So that's kind of telling. Maybe some of you are in contact with Colin, I don't know, and have more of an update, but that's from 3 years ago, from him admitting that the program hasn't worked for him, but he still believes that it can work. And when Kathy asked him about the allegations that kinship brought against him, his only response was, "People don't understand me." So very sad that it appears that he himself has not, he doesn't have any remorse, and he hasn't learned from his own mistakes. Just a plug for Kathy Baldock, if you go to YouTube, she has some great videos there, very long videos talking about homosexuality in both scientific, religious, and social timelines through history. Highly recommend it. She talks a lot about the reason for homosexuality being condemned is because of patriarchy, penis, and penetration. And those three things, if you want to know more about how those come into play, check it out on YouTube, Unclobbering the Tangled Mess. She does a really good job of that. So anyway, I just wanted to give that little update on Colin Cook and where he is today with his story.
Hey, Boyd, do you know Kathy well enough that we could invite her to teach the class sometime?
Yeah, sure, certainly.
Okay, let's you and I talk about that, Ron. That's very interesting. I think a lot of people have been wondering where Colin is on this, and it sounds like he has no personal insight in it at this point.
I think it's interesting. If she interviewed him 3 years ago, he would have been 80. By that time, his sexual drive should have been running down for most people. And
Viagra does wonders.
Yeah, yeah. What a sad story. Somebody told me that his ex-wife is friends of ours, and I just looked it up, and I'm a friend of hers. So I didn't know who she was with her married name. Bob Martin, thank you for being here, Bob. I always appreciate you. And let me get you to unmute here. And
thank you. Yeah, thank you, Lauren. Thank you, Lauren. And thank you, Ron. I think the first time I met you while you're doing postdoc while we were at Columbia University and those sessions at St. Paul's Chapel. I really appreciated them. I have a couple questions. Number one, do you see any signs that over time the church will moderate its posture and become a little more inclusive and sensitive in that regard, in terms of LGBTQ members? And secondly, which I don't fully understand the policy, are they saying that just the designation of LGBTQ is enough to sanction person, even if whether or not they're practicing? Because if that's the case, then they're heterosexuals and they could be practicing or non-practicing heterosexuals, just as though they could be practicing or non-practicing gay members. Do they make a distinction in that regard? Those are my two questions. Thanks again.
Thanks, Bob. Now the first question, remind me, I'm sorry, it slipped my mind.
Yes, whether or not you see any
Yes.
indication that the church is moderating over time.
I see. I need to talk about this about two different points of view. I have said umpteen times over the last 4 decades that the LGBT issue will not make strong progress in the church until the church deals with the women's issue. The church has not dealt with the women's issue yet. On the other hand, so I think that makes me not very cheerful in my thinking. But on the other hand, the time will come when it will just absolutely have to, and it will it will also have to deal with us. It's just going to see itself go down, and while they can keep on saying we're growing, God is with us, they don't see that things are going the other way, but in fact they're going the other way, and the future for the Adventist Church is not very rosy as I see it now. The data are very clear. So I think that the time will come when people will say things are going wrong. It's not rah rah rah. We better have a different sort of leadership, and that's what I think may happen. But maybe it'll be too late when that happens.
Right.
But at the moment, there's no sign of it. And from the very top, if we think of the General Conference as being the church,
right, yes,
remember Ted Wilson is not the president of the church, even though he may call himself that. He's the president of the General Conference. That's an administrative position. The whole idea of having the different levels, remember, was Ellen White said, let's have unions so that we do not have too much of a concentration of power. So the different levels were put in place in order to have different things in different places.
Yes.
Now, what was the other question?
Thank you.
Did I do it?
Right. I wanted to know whether or not the church makes a distinction between practicing and non-practicing gays or practicing and non-practicing heterosexuals. Is it?
Well, the official position talks about LGBT people being welcome to come, but not if they're practicing. Okay? You're supposed to have wings, but not use them to fly. But the truth is, if we look at what's happened in the last 2 weeks, and the General Conference's statement about the guy in Hamburg,
yes,
then that guy's not doing anything.
Right.
He's not practicing.
Yes.
He just said I want to be
right.
truthful with you.
Yes, yes.
And by saying that he was gay, suddenly he's unacceptable in the ministry. So that's not what they've said in the past, but it's a very significant change with what they're saying now.
I see. Thank you.
Thanks, Bob. Let me do a little advertisement here. You mentioned that I have talked about the church as a local church rather than the GC. We at Adventist today are reporting on things that happen at the GC and the decisions they make because we think we need to know them. But if I have to be honest with you, I would say find your church home locally. And I'm not sure that's always going to be easy for some people. But I can tell you a half a dozen churches that I know that have accepted gay people wholly, completely. Glendale City, Hollywood, the one in, I think it's Orlando where Randy goes. Others, there's just tons of churches, not tons, but there are some churches out there, and they're going to be unfortunately, probably in larger areas, larger cities. And I find it very tough. I find it very tough for some of the folks who live in places where there are only a very limited selection of churches. But my goodness, when I was a pastor here in Columbus at the Worthington Church, I really went to bat for my lesbian members. And I asked my church directly, you have to accept these people. Will you accept them? I won't ask them to come and be part of this organization if you're going to treat them badly. And there's a lack of courage out there right now in a lot of pastors. And the church, once they got to know these lovely women as true friends, they really did accept them. So Floyd, we have to, something I'd suggest, Floyd, I've often thought about this, and I don't know if you've ever done it, but wouldn't it be nice to have a list of open accepting churches on the Kingship website? These are places where you can go and they're going to love you. They're not going to chase you away. Have you ever thought about doing that?
Actually, there is a beginning of a list. It's hard to have a comprehensive list, but there is a list of some of the more accepting ones that we're aware of. Mm-hmm. So yeah, on the Kingship website.
Oh, good. Let's post that list somewhere, the link to that, because we really need to make that available to people. When I go to California, I go to Glendale City Church because precisely for that reason. It's a wide open, liberal, accepting church, not just of gay people, but of heretics like me and some of the rest of us who have ideas that aren't mainstream. Clarence, can I get you to unmute and join the conversation?
Yes. Well, let me say thanks to the Dr. Lawson for this wonderful presentation. I have a few concerns. Let me voice them this way. The official position of the church says, you're all welcome, but not to be practicing, essentially. Isn't it that?
Yes.
Okay. No. So you are welcome to be in the congregation and so on, but not to be a practicing gay person. I think the same would apply to any other sinner. That is to say, you're welcome to the congregation, but if you have a reputation of being a thief, well, we say, well, look, take it easy on the thievery, huh? And be careful and don't be a kleptomaniac. But you're welcome to be in church. We would say the same thing for liars, for any sinner. In other words, a church is not a social institution. It is primarily a spiritual institution with a particular text. It has a particular text. And it seems to me that while time lasts, that is the text we have. Our foundational text, both Old T and New T, says something about practicing gay relationships. We can't change the text. It will always be there. And so we are faced with a problem. True enough, outside the society at large goes a certain way. But then Christian bodies will always have a problem with that, for the simple reason that the text says something else. We will have all kinds of explanations. I agree, we will have all kinds of reasonings, but the text will always be there. We cannot change it. And this very text has split certain churches, not talking about Adventist churches, some other congregations. I was reading some years ago, a certain bishop came and announced openly that he was gay. Well, that split the church right down the middle. Now I heard, essentially, if we are faithful to a partner, that's okay. Well, I hear you, but frankly, it leaves me uncomfortable. Not comfortable at all with that. That if you are faithful to a partner, because the text does say a man shall marry a woman, that he lives his life as he wants, and he has adventures and so on and so on. Well, certainly, but to be not a diehard, but to be a recognized, practicing gay person, that poses a problem with the text that we have. And I was saying to myself a while ago, let us imagine a situation where we have, let us say, 50% of the young, those who are those who are able to have children. We have 50% of our congregation in gay relationships. That congregation is going to die. Certainly. It is on its way down. It seems to me, therefore, in fact, that the entire Christian structure, whether it be Adventist or others, because the evangelicals have the very same problem. It seems to me that the entire Christian structure is going into a wall. The text says one thing, and if we want to be true to the text, then that is what it says. We can interpret, Genesis can be interpreted, we can say it's poetry, and so on. But that particular case cannot be interpreted otherwise. It says it clearly, thou shalt not. That's what it says. And so when we come up against it, we can speak of God's forgiveness, we can argue for God's grace and so on. I'm okay with that. And in fact, that's what the text itself says. God can forgive every sin, but God encourages us, but the text encourages us to opt for, call it what you will, sacrificial living, fighting against sin, or whatever. If we choose not to call it sin, then we'll have to change the text somewhere. Because the text, we cannot say, according to the text that we have, that will encourage a sinful practice.
Clarence?
It seems to me
Clarence,
that is as simple as that. Yes.
I don't think we're going to have time to answer it because we have other people who want to speak, but let's give a chance to.
Okay, so let me hear what the doctor says on that.
I think we've got the essence of it.
Yes.
Of what you're asking. Ron, what Clarence is saying is probably not unusual, and I do wish, Clarence, you would read Alicia Johnston's book. But this is a very common idea that somehow on this issue we have to be very strict about those few texts that seem to condemn homosexuality. There is a notion in the mind of a lot of ethical Christians, however, that there's more to doing the moral thing than just following the text strictly, because what would you do with slavery and polygamy?
I would recommend the Clarence Reed, Alicia's book. It sounds like you haven't read it, Clarence, and you really should not hold forth the way you are without going through that evidence. And I do not have time to go through all the texts with you, otherwise we'll be well over time. It also is related to how one interprets the scripture at all. How we get the scripture and what we make of it. And that is a really big issue within Adventism today among the scholars. And the hermeneutic is not that of a fundamentalist anymore. It cannot be. If you've got education, you can't possibly be a fundamentalist. And so that's where I am. And I'm afraid we don't have time for more. But the answer is to go and see read Alicia Johnston's book.
Chris, I'm going to give you a chance to get in here too. Chris, you come at this from a very personal point of view from your own family. You've talked about this in the past.
Oh, I'm happy to talk about it now as well. My name is Chris Widmer. I'm a former pastor, current chaplain. I live in Chico, California, and the good saints of Chico didn't know that they had a father of a trans woman playing the guitar for church today, leading out in music. So that's where I was at 10 o'clock this morning Pacific time. I'm an ally. I can't be anything other. I'm a dad. I'm a husband. I'm a father of 2 daughters now. My heart breaks for the stories that I hear. And I wasn't here for Ron's presentation, unfortunately, but I type things in the chat, and you just wonder when this will change. And I think Ron's exactly right that until the women's issue is solved, it may not. And I think the Adventist Church, well, until that's solved, how are we going to make progress in the inclusion of LGBT people? Our friends, our neighbors, our children, our grandchildren. We have to somehow not teach our families to estrange themselves from their kids. And, this is an issue for our time. And someone put in the chat that, really, nobody really emphasizes the phrase that the gays are just not supposed to be in the church, but they're supposed to be killed. They're supposed to be cut off from the people of God. And I don't hear anybody advocating for that other than the most extreme positions. But I don't hear that in the church, that we should kill gay people. But that's what the Bible says. Bible's clear on that if you read that Leviticus text. So I think the Adventist Church is ripe for an organizational split on this issue in the Western world. It's ripe for a split. It's just a matter of what would be the catalyst for that. Is it the new sexual committee that Ted Wilson has initiated at the spring meeting, which I saw on the AT website here this morning? What will be the catalyst for people who are here in this group and dozens of hundreds of people around the world who will say, I need a new community, one that harmonizes with this. So I'm not living with this angst in my heart, and I'm not expected to be silent, not expected to be shunning of the people that I know and love and the people I care about. I'm tired of, yes, truly so. I left the Adventist ministry because I didn't want to be silent, and I was expected to be silent, and I didn't want to go through the whole defrocking thing. I'm not retired yet. I'm still an Adventist minister through the GC, but I wonder for how much longer, given the statements that have been presented recently. I'm still flying under the radar.
Yeah, are you supposed to be rejecting your your trans daughter know, because as an Adventist pastor, I think you're in a region where you probably can survive this. Would not be true in all regions of the church.
Well, I'm not sure, because if people want to look up my story, they can Google Chris and Debbie Widmer Outspoken, and you'll see a 24-minute video that Debbie and I did. It came out on the internet the week before was my last Sabbath as the pastor of a church. I don't know if I would have survived that, Lauren.
Yeah,
I really don't know. I don't know.
Thank you for being on the side of gay people, but LGBTQ people, but also on the side as a pastor. I feel a pastor should be on the side of all who are disenfranchised or left out.
I'll say it again. If God's amazing grace, which is one of the songs we sang this morning at church, if God's amazing grace is not so amazing that it can't draw a circle to include all people who practice sex differently than the established, you got to have a marriage certificate and be heterosexual and do the missionary position and with the lights off. I don't know, that might be a little extreme. But if God's amazing grace is not big enough to include the unwed mother, the unwed father, the people who are doing sex differently, and that includes our LGBT people, then it's not amazing grace. It's just, I don't know what it is. I don't know what to call it, but it's not amazing grace.
You know, Ron, I thank you so much for being willing to answer all these questions about what's going to be happening in the future. I have a hard time figuring out why our leaders are so tone deaf. I mean, if they could have designed a better way of alienating Western young people than they did in saying, you're being assaulted by social media, we're going to tell you what the Bible says, and we're going to do it in TikTok videos. I mean, really? Give me a break. How sad. Ron, we're out of time. I just want to say again, I can't tell you how much I appreciate you personally as my friend and as a sociologist, scholar, and your willingness to come here and talk as you have. I really appreciate it. Thank you, Ron.
I'm happy to be here.
This is a historic telling of all of this story, and we are going to share it with people, and I hope it makes a difference. And again, we do know, those of us who know a lot of people in the church know that there are those who are on the right side of this issue. They want to be compassionate and inclusive, but they don't have the courage to speak out about it, sad to say.
I'd like to say one thing to add to what Chris said, and that is that the church is killing some gay people. I mean, did you look at the statistics of the study that was done at Andrews, which is reported in Guiding Families, about the proportion of people, Adventist young people who are LGBT, who have had suicidal attempts and thoughts, and I know several people who have killed themselves. Yes, they are killing us.
I've said this to you before, Floyd. I think one thing that kinship could do to make it into the Adventist Church conversation is to advocate in favor of suicide prevention, because nobody knows more about that than the gay community. You have lost so many, and I mentioned it in our last meeting. Hey, thank you so much, all of you. I'm sorry I didn't get to Ruth. I asked her to unmute, but she didn't. But our time is up, and we really do have to go. And I appreciate all of you being here. please remember, we've got about $10,000 left in our matching fund. I don't want to leave that money on the table. If you haven't given yet and you could give, please do. Just pitch in here and help us out. And it's pretty easy. You go to our aidtoday.org and there's a big old donate right on the top, and you can give a gift right there. And I really appreciate it if you would. I know how this is. I sometimes think, oh, I'm going to give to that, and then time goes on and I don't get around to it, and pretty soon the fundraiser is over. Well, this one is a timed one. We have to get it in within the next couple of weeks so we can get that money that Jan Chetty laid out there. And so come on, you guys who are saying, I'm going to give, I meant to give, I intend to give, I should give, do it now. All right. I hate to be a nag, but there you go. Thank you all. We'll get this recording up as soon as possible. And Ron, thank you especially. You are a hero. Bye-bye, everybody.